almost every room he entered for the majority of his life, he knew I could beat up anybody in here. I mean, he was taller, he was stronger, he had these long arms and these broad shoulders. He was a natural athlete. He was an excellent horseman in an age where that trait was widely admired because everybody rode a horse. Even Thomas Jefferson, who didn't like Washington, said he is the greatest horseman of our generation.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are with Timothy Holder, speaker, author, writer, coach. So welcome, Timothy.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Timothy, you've got quite a knowledgeable background. You were a serviceman's kid, a Navy kid, and then you went off to Carson Newman and got your applied theology degree, and then you went off to University of Kentucky and got a master's degree in history. You've done a little bit of everything, and now you're a writer and a coach. What's going on?
Well, yeah, I've worn a few different hats. I was a history professor, and I was a dean at Walter State Community College in Tennessee. But I wanted to have more time. I love teaching. I love history, but I wanted some time to do different things. I wanted more time to write. I wanted more time to do public speaking and promote my writing. And so now I work online for Liberty University, and I teach for them, and I teach a little bit for Walter State, but it's all online. So I've got the flexibility to go and do talks and look at primarily early presidents. So that's what I do. I write and I speak and I do some history teaching.
Well, the creative process, I tell people all the time that, listen, from a spiritual standpoint, when we talk about the creative process, listen, God created us in his image. Mm-hmm. And the first thing we know about God is God created the world, right? So Genesis 1:1. So when we talk about that creating in his image, I think that creative process is certainly a part of what he instilled in us. And that creative process can be a daunting task, and writing and articulating your thoughts onto paper so that other people can understand what you're trying to give them. That's a tough process. And it's one not for the weak of heart or the meek of heart. It's you got to have thick skin as you go through that process. And you got to know your work because people will call you on it, especially from a history standpoint. So tell us a little bit about your latest project. You've got several different projects that you've had out there, several different books. Tell us your latest project.
Yeah, I will do that. But I want to comment on something that you said about how it's not for the faint of heart. I remember I was working on a history textbook with a bunch of other history professors. And the first time I got really serious feedback on professional writing, the thought that went through my mind was writing is not a humbling process. It's a humiliating process. And so, like you say, it's tough, but it's necessary because you want to do your best work. But anyway, my latest book is called Forged in Fire and Hope, The Faith of Five Presidents. And so I took the Mount Rushmore presidents and James Garfield, and I wrote about their religious views. And James Garfield might seem like kind of a weird add-on, but he's the only guy who was a preacher who then became a president. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. So I thought that I thought it would make for an interesting story, because to me, that's what history is. It's interesting stories about interesting people. So I cover Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and James Garfield, forged in fire and hope.
Well, I mean, I've got a copy of the book, and I appreciate the insight that you give on each one of those presidents. The general public will not get into the weeds of these presidents, of these topics. And as a writer, you actually have to do that in order to get a sense of who they are. What are some of the strengths and weaknesses of these presidents that you've wrote about?
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so strengths and weaknesses. For George Washington and Abraham Lincoln both, the first thing that came to mind when you asked that question was they were both self-conscious about their lack of education. And so, that they perceived that as a weakness in themselves. Both of them really were lifelong learners and sought to continue to learn more and grow more. And they weren't limited by what they did not have. And so that weakness really became a strength. So that was cool.
That is cool to hear about, because you don't think about George Washington as being someone who was self-conscious about that, especially when you go to Mount Vernon and you go to his barn and you hear about how he was very intrigued with the different agricultural techniques. He had the round barn up there, and he was trying to find different agricultural products that worked well with the land up there. So that took a great deal of research, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think he was very intrigued with the almanacs and stuff that were coming out around that time. So
Yeah.
I never thought of him as someone who is self-conscious about his education.
He was quite shrewd. He was really a sharp guy. And he was intrigued by John Adams, who was much less popular than him. But John Adams was this great public speaker. And that was probably one of the things that fascinated Washington the most about him, because Washington was very self-conscious about public speaking, both because he didn't have like an education in the classics. He couldn't quote all the literature that like a Jefferson or a Madison or an Adams could quote. And Washington was also self-conscious about speaking because he had bad teeth. And then when he finally got fake teeth, artificial dentures, basically, they didn't ever really sit right. And so he was just self-conscious about talking. So, yeah, we don't think with this guy who is so heroic and such a leader of men and so widely loved, you don't think about the guy's insecurities. But yeah, he was driven by them. So, and it's funny because Lincoln becomes well known as this great public speaker. So they both lacked an education. They both really worked to better themselves. But public speaking was something that George Washington never really took command of. He did it when he had to, but he never really enjoyed it.
Talk to me about George Washington's faith a little bit.
Okay. So Washington, for the historians who are skeptical about his faith, they will point to some very specific things, like according to Washington's own records, when he was at home in Mount Vernon, he would only go to church about once a month, roughly. Like, he might go once and then go again in 2 weeks, but then it might be 6 weeks before he goes again. And they noted that he didn't take communion. And communion in the churches that he attended usually happened at the end of the service. And so he would get up and slip out rather than staying there for communion. And so one historian calls him kind of a lukewarm Episcopalian. And there are a few historians who will say he's a deist. Most won't say that. But really, if you drill down deep on Washington, he definitely seems to be a man of faith. He didn't take communion, but most men didn't back then. There was an Episcopal bishop named Meade in the 1800s who did a religious history of Virginia. And according to him, most of the working age men would slip out of church and not take the Lord's Supper. And I wonder if it's because these men got to town so infrequently and they would have to get home before it was dark. And so they would slip out before the end of the service so they could talk business and politics and whatever. For George and Martha Washington, there were two wagons. They would ride one or the other to get to church on Sunday. The smaller one, the horses could pull it faster. It was a 2.5 hour trip one way to get to church. The bigger, heavier one, which was the one they would need if they were going to ship something to town to sell or buy something, or if they had people going with them, 3.5 hours one way. So you've got to leave town 3.5 hours before it gets dark to get back. And if you want to conduct any kind of business and have any kind of communication with people at all, it's really not shocking that some people were slipping out of church. So that explains both his infrequent attendance and why he slipped out early. But when Washington was in town already for a Sunday, he would usually go to church twice. And Washington had several close brushes with death, and he attributed his survival to God protecting him for some great purpose. So Washington lived his whole life believing in a God who intervened in the affairs of men, and believing that God had some great purpose for him. And he was conscious of that and felt the responsibility for that. So also, Washington was elected to the vestry in his church, which was kind of like being elected as a deacon or an elder. And there are people who say, well, Washington, he gave a lot of speeches, but he doesn't mention Jesus. But every year that he agreed to serve another year in the vestry, he would have made a public affirmation of faith in Jesus. So he was very open about his faith in certain contexts, and he was seen by his friends and neighbors as a leader in the church. So that's his faith in a nutshell.
There's a an undercurrent with George Washington and his faith and his association with the Masons, the Freemasons, and that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. What's your viewpoint on that association?
I don't really know a lot about the Masons, and I think that's kind of the point. They're pretty secretive. Um, I have known in my lifetime people who have been in the Masons who are Christians, and so they didn't see any conflict between the two. So I don't know that that sheds any light on Washington's faith at all, and that's
Yeah,
that's about all I can say about that.
yeah. Tell our listeners how they can find your podcast.
Oh,
Tell
okay.
them.
Thank you. I do a radio show and podcast called The Leading Edge with Dr. Tim Holder. And so it's available wherever you get a podcast. And if you're thinking, well, I don't normally listen to them, so I don't know where they would be, just go online and type in The Leading Edge with Dr. Tim Holder, and it'll take you there. And so I interview Christian leaders. So it might be an author one week, and it might be a Christian actor the next week, or a Christian musician. I do a lot of pastors and some teachers, so some business owners.
You have a bent towards leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So tell why that particular bent.
That's a good question. And I wonder if that was really driven by I'm a 58-year-old man. I've been working since I was 14. I've had a lot of bosses. There are different kinds of leadership styles. I've had some really fantastic bosses. I've had some bad ones. And with the bad ones, I would always think, there are different ways to be at least a decent boss. Just pick one and do that. Is that so hard? And so that, I think, helped me get interested in leaders. But also, when I was in graduate school, my dissertation was actually what didn't have anything to do with presidents. It was on medieval Europe. And my question that I wrestled with for my dissertation was, when a king died and didn't have an obvious heir, how did they decide who the next king would be? And so that was the issue I explored. But when I started teaching college, I got interested in US presidents and how some were from rich families, some were poor, some had military backgrounds, some were career politicians. And so there were different paths to success. So just that general idea of how do people go through life and be successful and become leaders? What are the keys to doing that well? What are the things that trip people up? So yeah, I guess that's where all that comes from for me.
Well, in your research with George Washington and other leaders of the Revolution, describe Washington's style.
Hmm. Okay, so it's interesting because, from a presidential standpoint, you've got a Thomas Jefferson, who's a very charismatic guy, can be friends with anyone, and that was how he led successfully. People liked him. He was super smart. He had good ideas, and so he was able to draw people to him. And then you've got a James Madison who formed partnerships with various people. Somebody wrote a book called Madison's Gift, and it was about how Madison could join forces with someone and do really great work, and then join forces with somebody else and do really great work. Washington's leadership style was to always be this dignified, reserved gentleman. And it didn't hurt that he was tall. And so, people would meet him and he'd be kind of a father figure, and he was incredibly strong. And it's funny because everybody in America knows who George Washington is, and we all know a few things about him. It's unfortunate that most things that people know, half of them aren't even true. Like his teeth weren't wooden and he didn't chop down the cherry tree. But one thing that we've lost is George Washington was this incredible physical specimen. He probably went through his life, well, not probably, almost every room he entered for the majority of his life, he knew I could beat up anybody in here. I mean, he was taller, he was stronger, he had these long arms and these broad shoulders. He was a natural athlete. He was an excellent horseman in an age where that trait was widely admired because everybody rode a horse. Even Thomas Jefferson, who didn't like Washington, said he is the greatest horseman of our generation. And so, to give the love to somebody you don't even like, Washington must have been extraordinary on horseback. And so those physical characteristics in an age where that was valued so much, that just helped to draw people to him. So he had all of that going for him.
There was a cabal that Gates was involved in, and some of the others were involved in, to unseat Washington during the war. What failings in Washington's personality or strengths in Washington's personality allowed him to overcome that cabal?
Okay. So what's interesting about Washington is his whole life, he had been successful by physically imposing his will and trying really hard and making things happen. Again, he's this tall, big, strong guy, and he assumed that he was going to enjoy life in the upper crust of Virginia society because his dad was well-to-do. But then his dad died when young George was just 11 years old, and so after that, he really became this scrapper, and he had to be smart and work hard to succeed. And so he gets into the Revolution, and he realizes the only way to beat the British is to beat the British. I've got to get out there with my troops. I've got to fight. I've got to bloody their nose. I've got to make them realize this isn't worth it. Let's just leave the Americans alone. But he was good enough as a general to realize there were many times where his army was just overmatched. And the only way they were going to live to fight another day was by running. And so these really strong feelings of, I have to fight, but I can't fight today, would sometimes paralyze him. And so, sometimes people get paralyzed when it comes to making decisions in the haze of war, the fog of war. Sometimes they get paralyzed because they're afraid to make a decision. With Washington, it was just, he was so mixed-minded, he couldn't make up his mind. And that made him a less than excellent army tactician. He was good, but not great. And that was what kept him from being great, is Washington was famously reserved, but he also had this volcanic temper. And sometimes he would just want to fight so much, but he was so smart, he knew he couldn't. And so it would, like I said, it would freeze him up. So that was kind of his weakness. His strength was that he was excellent in leading men and inspiring men, because he's got these troops that are getting beaten over and over again. They're not getting paid. They're not getting fed right. They've got all these problems. But Washington is such an inspiring figure that he keeps them together. And as far as this cabal goes, Washington, like a lot of people who are really reserved, he doesn't have 100 friends. So when he does put his trust in someone, he really loves that person. And he had this guy, his personal secretary, his aide de camp, a colonel named Joseph Reed. Reed started sending letters to another general saying, I don't think Washington's the guy to get the job done. I think you'd probably do a better job. And so he's corresponding with this other general. Washington opens up this official satchel of mail and opens up a letter written to Colonel Reed because Washington thinks it's official military business. And it turns out it's a private letter from this general. And the general makes it clear in the letter what Reed has been saying about Washington. And so it was just brutal for Washington to feel betrayed. And there's also this, I'd like to wring the guy's neck. I'd like to fire him. But if I kick him out, it makes me look petty. But it would also free up Colonel Reed to now speak very openly about Washington being incompetent. Yeah, he couldn't even handle the truth because when he found out what I was saying, he tried to silence me, but here I am. So Washington keeps the guy as his secretary for quite some time longer and doesn't even say anything at first. But yeah, it was pretty brutal. And the Americans, they were in such a bad situation anyway. It's really easy to second guess a guy when he's not winning. So that's what drove a lot of that. And then also petty jealousies. And you would think that anybody who rises to the rank of general would be so pleased with what they've accomplished that they'd be team players at least. But a lot of generals throughout history, the history of militaries around the world, a lot of them are extremely prideful. And so if they think they're a little bit better than you, then they want that recognition.
It is interesting when you get into different levels of society, and you think. Let's talk about church work, for instance. You get into church work and you go, okay, well, everybody in church is pulling in the same direction. Everybody is, they're seeking after the right thing and that sort of thing. But then you get into church work and you go, oh, these are people.
Yeah.
with all
Yep.
with all the good and bad that goes along with people. All the
Absolutely.
and the personalities. You have different personalities that can grind a church to a halt or grind a program to a halt. That certainly is the way it is in the military. And you have a lot of A teamers or A personalities, type A personalities that get together. It is interesting how long that war was that they were able to hold it together. And I find that very much a part of the beauty of Washington and his personality, that he was able to stay in that leadership position all the way through.
Yeah.
It says a lot about how other people thought about him too, and how they understood the situation. He could have been one that was a micromanager. I'm not sure that he was. I don't think he could have survived if he was a micromanager. I
Yeah.
think he turned over realms of influence to people he thought could handle it, and he had to wrestle with a Congress that was pretty petty in and of itself and overruled
Hmm.
him in many ways. So it's amazing. The first President's Day was named after George Washington, and this was
Hmm.
years after the Revolutionary War. This was after the Civil War. It was created by a Union general that was trying to mend the country back together. And it's
Mm.
interesting that he chose Washington's birthday as the day for everyone to celebrate. And it was a resounding yes, we all want to do this, because a lot of people were already celebrating Washington to begin with. So it says a lot about him. You've talked
Yep.
about his insecurities. You've talked about his some of his weaknesses, but yet he was used in that way. He was the man for that time. And
Hmm.
kudos to you for writing about that and bringing that to the public. We need to hear that. We need to hear that God can use us in just about any fashion, form or fashion. And if you were to give a 10-word response about George Washington and what he meant to the country, what would that 10-word response be?
Wow. Okay. I wish I'd had time to look this up, because there was that quotation at his funeral by one of the Lee boys about first in war, first in peace, and first in the heart of his countrymen, or something like that. Yeah. I mean, we had four national holidays: Christmas, Easter, Independence Day, and George Washington's birthday. So what does that tell us? Yeah, and to even to your point, there's the Union General who thinks the one guy who can bring Americans together after the Civil War is the memory of George Washington. So never perfect, but always extraordinary. George Washington.
Well, that's good. That's good. Well, this is a question I ask all of my guests, or I try to ask all my guests if we have time. What does liberty mean to Timothy Holder?
Liberty is the pursuit of personal freedom. And in our country's history, it was like the cornerstone of what we were all about, is creating a society where people were free to pursue happiness within the constraint of not oppressing, our brothers and sisters around us, our fellow citizens. And so the tricky thing when it comes to liberty is that's been a great blessing for our country throughout history. But then we had this idea of, let's also make this country fair, which is a noble aim. But eventually, those two things have kind of started to get on a collision course. And I heard this example. There was a guy talking recently, like, you start with, we want everything to be fair. So, hey, let's make things fair for homeowners, and let's make the environment safe for everyone, because that sounds fair. But you got this guy who lives in California who said, I need to go through a 14-step process to repair my own roof. And it includes 2 home inspections, and it's my roof. And so at what point does our desire for fairness actually start to become oppressive? And so that's the challenge. And so you see that now politically in the battles between left and right. Like, for some people, it just seems fair that marriage is something that's extended beyond heterosexual couples. So let people of the same sex be married. But then once you've decided, okay, that's the law of the land and we want to be fair, but you've got the Christian baker or the Christian florist who says it goes against my religious convictions to participate in that ceremony. And people say, well, now you're discriminating against them. So we're going to sue your businesses. So, so you've got this idea of fairness, but now it's running into the liberty of the business owner to run their business according to their conscience. And so we used to talk a lot about freedom of conscience. I should be able to do what I feel is right and what I feel is wrong. And so the threat to that becomes when there are people of a certain political persuasion who say, we want to make things fair for one group. And if that goes against your conscience, well, shame on you, because, hey, who doesn't want life to be fair? So that's the threat to liberty, it seems.
So tell us a little bit about your project, your last book, and how people can get a hold of it and where they can reach you on the web.
If you were to go to TDH, that's just my initials, TDH Communications, that would be my website. And all of my books are available at Amazon. The easiest way to find me there is type in Timothy D. Holder. There are other Timothy Holders out there. You wouldn't think so. It's not the most common name, but there's a Timothy Holder who wrote the Hip Hop Prayer book. That was not me. I did not write that book. I am Timothy D. Holder. And again, my most recent book is Forged in Fire and Hope. And it's about the religious views of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and James Garfield. It was really fun doing the research on those guys and exploring what they thought about faith. And then some of those guys, Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, they're just fun guys to learn about. So I enjoyed working on the project.
And your podcast, how can they hear you on your podcast?
Yes, again, just go to The Leading Edge with Dr. Tim Holder.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Holder.
Well, thank you. This was a lot of fun. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.